Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and in the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about zombies. They're not necessarily fast zombies, in fact they move pretty slow when you think about it, but they are incredibly powerful, with some having similar power to that of some nation states. That's right, today we're talking about a funeral for neoliberalism. 2020 changed everything again, and almost felt like Groundhog Day if you were paying attention. This time, it was the atrophy in the market ecosystem, and its loss of diversity that would ultimately lead to it so easily failing. Because in many places, if one company wasn't able to do the work, then an entire supply chain could easily be shut down. This, in addition to the hollowing out of our local supply chains by years of neoliberal globalism, in which we sought out the poorest places in the world to do our labor so that we could reduce labor costs and thus the cost of consumer goods as much as possible. That was one of the many sequential deals with the devil that capitalism has made to keep this stock market growing. And just like any good deal with the devil, it is only a very short-term solution, and you'll have to be right back to sell just a bit more of your soul next year. All of these things together mean that businesses just couldn't easily stay in business, even without periods of lockdowns further complicating things, especially in the restaurant industry. And while they were absolutely necessary, where they were implemented, these lockdowns did create a pandemic economic trend that shifted away from going places to get things and more to relying on underpaid and underbenefited gig workers to deliver them to you. And not only were the public more dependent on this, and a lot of these struggling businesses were as well, because this was the only way that they could still get, say, food from local restaurants. But at the same time, the gig company is also squeezing the restaurant's bottom line so much that they have to drastically increase their volume of sales to even make the same profits that they used to. This creates even more toxic workplaces in the industry for less profits than used to exist. So in many ways, the pandemic was just the perfect disaster to make us rely even more on Amazon Prime home delivery instead of shopping at a local store, or Grubhub Uber Eats instead of going to your local restaurant or just picking up the food there yourself, which would surely be more profitable for your local business. And all of those businesses that were still struggling for all of the previous competition and through all of these crises that I described for small businesses during the last decade, they were now ready to tumble like a house of cards at a stiff breeze, and the pandemic hit them more like a hurricane. Much like anybody that's been laying around on life support for the last 12 years, our economic body had atrophy that wasn't ready for an opportunistic infection to just make things worse. For individual people who were already struggling to pay the bills or were living paycheck to paycheck, any lost time could put them financially underwater. And with the Fed keeping interest rates low, we were disincentivized from saving at all. But actually, there was some level of bailouts for the people, unlike the last time. But these were disproportionately small compared to the bailouts given to the investors months before politicians ever openly considered payments to the public. Other than the effect of lockdowns, and again, I still think that they were worth it, just not that they didn't come with a ton of economic downsides. With our weak supply chains broken over international borders, that meant that if we didn't have what we needed now, we weren't getting any more of it soon. But at the same time, perhaps because of lockdowns as well, we temporarily stopped consuming nearly as much and demand fell. And while we stopped over-consuming packaged BS and just vibed for a minute, we took a break for some Netflix and chill until we watched all of Netflix and become too chill for it. See, the stock market, which is what we were responding to with the bailout, is really just a graph of rich people's feelings. And rich people felt like the pandemic was going to be really bad for them. So they started to pull their money out of the stock market. And because this is a modern problem and causing stocks to lower in price, this and sometimes led to algorithmic controls kicking in, called stop loss for certain people's accounts that were set to automatically sell at a certain margin as a way of cutting off losses. So every few cents the stock price drops, more and more of these kick in, selling off more and more stock, creating an algorithmic death spiral that can sometimes be hard for companies to get out of. And this is just another way that modern financial technology can be absolutely catastrophic. and lead to even more dramatic failures in the stock market than were previously even possible. Now, this isn't the reason that the stock market fell entirely, mind you, but it is a very modern contribution to that particular economic catastrophe. And really early on in the pandemic, you could hear the wealthy talking about inflation, because from their perspective, there was a lot of inflation happening early in the pandemic, because so many wealthy people had so much more money that they had just cashed out of the stock market. And the things that wealthy people wanted to buy, such as luxury items or homes, and unfortunately they're hedging their bets by pulling their money out of the stock market and putting it into real estate. These were the first sorts of places that we saw big inflation numbers because, relatively speaking, there wasn't a supply and demand imbalance in the kind of things that normal people bought. But to the wealthy, it was suddenly more and more money chasing less and less. And all of this because of the Federal Reserve's massive cash infusion. So people who didn't understand what was going on must have thought it seemed paradoxical that right after the biggest stock market crash and the hugest unemployment numbers since the Great Depression, the stock market just shoots off like a rocket. It was at this point that a reasonable person would conclude that the previous era of economic politics had died, that everything that we understood about economics wasn't real anymore, that it was all just fake. Someone was propping it up. We were all at this economic weekend in Bernie's situation. As actions that were previously unprecedented happened once more, changing the very dynamics of the system entirely and doubling down on everything that had made the 2010s unstable. And everyone looked in awe as the stock market seemed unable to fail, even though we all knew of the struggles that so many people were having. And at the same time, and even further began to decouple the idea of the GDP and stock market growth being good for everyone. Because while the wealthy suckers were paying millions of dollars for a receipt of a JPEG image, it was also estimated that the child tax credit ended and as much as 50% of Americans' children began to go hungry. And this was even before one factory shut down and the monopolistic cartel that runs the baby formula industry in this country made that situation so much dramatically worse. And that was even before we started ending free school lunch programs across the country, making the problem even worse. And all of this is just such a perfect example of how all of these things over the last 14 years cumulatively have made our economic body nothing more than a shambling corpse, dragging its feet through Washington, D.C., screaming out of increasingly deranged lobbyists, "Bailouts! Bailouts! Bailouts!" Bailouts! We have a body which is like the ship of Theseus, has been replaced through mergers and acquisitions. So every piece of it that is left is some fledgling tech startup that's never been able to run a successful business in their life in anything that resembles the traditional economic sense or traditional economic environment. And as the previous environment becomes unstable, how will these companies survive? And we can't just keep going on like this, even when a war on the other side of the planet can drive us into an economic crisis. I think we have to face it. Capitalism just might not be profitable anymore to the capitalist class. We may have reached the logical extremes of infinite growth in the stock market and nearly destroyed our planet in doing so. So the next time there's a major economic collapse or recession, we have to be louder than the zombie lobbyists wandering around DC. We have to demand that the government let these companies fail so that new companies can be born to take over. New companies that actually might be competitive in a market that isn't so explicitly rigged in their benefit. After so long on this corporate welfare system, it seems like large parts of our economy won't be able to go on without this direct government subsidy. And if it can't, maybe it should be allowed to die, so that something better can be born and replace it. Something that can actually do the job that it was meant to do within our society. Maybe we can take this time to imagine a completely different economic system. And I think that we will have to ask the question, How much will we allow the world to cannibalize itself before we put this thing out of its misery?
Which leads me to my second rule, the double tap. In those moments when you're not sure the undead are really dead, don't get all stingy with your bullets. I mean, one more clean shot to the head. And this lady could have avoided becoming a human Happy Meal.
And it's not to say that we will come out socialist on the other side, because there are probably a lot of other philosophical alternatives to capitalism that aren't just socialist and communist, and a lot of the wealthy ruling class would probably prefer them. But I think that the very least that we could do is to come away with this with the basic mathematical conclusion that the age of infinite growth is over, and that we must find a new way to organize society and production rather than for the maximization of profit. But until the powers that be realize this very basic reality, we are living inside the corpse of American capital, unsure how long it may live, how long it may go on like this. Forever? Or if it may just suddenly and gradually completely fall apart before our eyes. And I know that I've explained this largely in the American context, but it is important to point out that some of these same problems exist around the world. There are a number of other companies propping up zombie companies with the equivalent of their central banks. As I alluded to in my previous video, China had a similar problem with Evergrande, which was basically their housing market, but also simultaneously one of the largest investment firms in their country. Countries like Russia and the OPEC nations are seeing that the time of oil is finally coming to an end, which is really scary for those countries because at least in modern history, these countries have been highly dependent on exporting highly profitable oil and gas to be able to keep their countries economically stable. It's probably due to this long-term economic instability that Russia is invading Ukraine now, while oil prices are still high, to secure Ukraine's massive reserves of oil, much of which are located in the Donbass region and the area around Crimea. Go figure. But breaking as I write this, though, Russia is actually defaulting on its national debts for the first time since the Soviet Revolution. In the time between, they also defaulted on their local debts once, and that alone had a very negative impact on the ruble. Russia, to its credit though, could pay these debts if they had access to their foreign holdings, which, much like Afghanistan's money, are under American sanction. So there's a pretty foolproof way of solving this problem for them by working towards an acceptable peace agreement with their invaded neighbor and America dropping the sanctions. But they still seek to control Ukraine's oil and pipelines, so that doesn't look very likely, which signals that very bad times could be around the corner for the Russian state economically. So there's broad cracks showing in the old world's economic foundations, and more countries are turning to this laissez-faire state capitalism as an answer. But before we look at the final piece of the puzzle, there's something I want to clarify. Much of this Fed process of low interest rate loans for companies unable to stay in business without them is called quantitative easing, or just QE. I don't so much like that term because when I hear it, it feels like my brain says incoming financial mumbo jumbo and just tunes out. Which is why, despite this topic being central in the series, I only now mention it for the folks who stuck around, but also to say that QE is not the same as modern monetary theory or MMT. MMT says, and this is a summary, I have longer videos on this topic if you're interested, that under a special set of circumstances that include a fiat currency, that government spending may not have a direct correlation with inflation, which seems to be the old way of seeing government economic decisions. You know, the whole how are they going to pay for it and all of that. Most people with a surface understanding of that think that MMT is a way for excusing the Fed money cannons, and it's important to note that it isn't. MMT specifies that this money must be spent within the national economy, within the same currency, and for resources that aren't in short supply, because it's largely spending outside of these conditions that causes inflation. And again, this is a reduction because I'm trying to explain this all in under a minute. MMT controls inflation by using this knowledge to spend government funds in specific ways that are unlikely to correlate to inflation. QE floods monopolies and their startup competitors with money to spend in any way they can imagine, which is much more likely to drive inflation as the Fed pours cash into the market, either without either it, through quantitative tightening, or the federal government through taxation, actually pulling any of this money out. This may be more my experience of MMTers on the left, which is where I think most of the academic thought on this topic is. And as such, we tend to be opposed to bailouts and in favor of grassroots economic stimulus anyways. I'm just saying that claiming that QE is just MMT is massively missing the point here. It's not that government shouldn't subsidize things at all. Indeed, many of our greatest advances, even ones that private companies would ultimately take credit for, have been funded by or discovered entirely through government funding. And facing a dire climate and energy future, which may cause additional great stress on our ability to feed people, we do need cheap money chasing answers in a responsible way. But subsidizing Uber isn't that.